Welcome to the video, the 6 common misunderstandings concerning the divine will. And the way we'll proceed is we'll start with number 6, which will be the least common or the least egregious misunderstanding about the divine will. And the first one that we'll talk about will be blasphemy. Now, we will not only talk about the misunderstandings, but what group is associated with the misunderstanding. So in this case, the misunderstanding is predominantly, almost all, by those outside of the divine will. And that being people who are not attempting to live within the divine will of God and are looking from the outside, looking at the writings of Luisa Piccarreta and making certain opinions that may not be substantiated. So the definition of this in particular misunderstanding, to paraphrase, is, quote, some of Luisa's writings are inappropriately intimate. And I ran into an individual who held this view, and he was adamant that that was the case. And he gave excerpts from the Book of Heaven to substantiate his claim. But the problem is that he didn't understand that it's not sensual a conversation that she's having with Jesus. It's mystical conversation. It's mystical symbolism of a soul's relationship to God. And good examples of that are in the poetry of St. John of the Cross, and he was definitely not a blasphemer. And it can be seen quite evidently in the book from the Old Testament, the Canticle of Canticles. And all you need to do to understand what I'm saying about that is to read the very first paragraph of the Canticle of Canticles, and you'll see exactly what I'm referring to. The next one, and these first two, they're rather easy to address, and they're not, as I mentioned, very common, but I've seen them brought up, so I'm going to address them here. The next one is Millenarianism, and this is a view also held from people outside of the divine will, looking in, and the definition, and I believe this definition comes from Catholic Answers, so I want to give them the credit. At the end time, Christ will return in all his splendor to gather together the just, to annihilate hostile powers, and to found a glorious kingdom on earth for the enjoyment of the highest spiritual and material blessings. He himself will reign as its king. And this is almost similar to the view of the Jews going back to before when Jesus arrived, where they're looking for a king, they're looking for someone to come and lead them to defeat the Romans and basically to establish a world power. And the divine will has nothing to do with the return of Jesus and his physical presence. There's no messianic physical return of Jesus. It's not the emphasis of the writings of Luisa Piccarreta. It's about the gift of divine will. And the gift is itself spiritual, us living in the divine will with participation with Jesus. And there's nothing in there about any worldly kingdom that will be created with Jesus as its king. Now, there is the fulfillment, however, of the Our Father, which may be confusing to some people. So, in the Our Father, it's Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And there's also talk in the writings of Luisa Piccarreta, of Jesus to Luisa, as a matter of fact, concerning the kingdom of the divine will. But again, as Jesus said in the New Testament, my kingdom is not of this world. And he often spoke of a kingdom then, but not of this world. The next one is Quietism, and Quietism is often thrown about by people that may not even quite understand what it is. So, and some of these words are not frequently used, so that's one of the reasons why I have a definition here. And again, the group that misunderstands this are those outside of the divine will. The definition is that denies the necessity of human activity in contemplation and in sanctification. Asserts that the highest spirituality is attained when the mind and will are completely inactive. So it's a very passive view of our relationship with the divinity. In other words, it would be as if we have to do nothing. We just say we want to live in the divine will, we sit back, and God does all the rest. Well, that's not the case at all. And here's a quote from Volume 26, August 3rd, 1929. We do not give our goods, our graces, nor do we tell our truths to one who is not disposed, to one who does not pay attention to listen to us in order to learn our sublime lessons and model her life according to our teachings. So that is a requirement of our active participation to dispose our souls and to model our lives. There's nothing passive or inactive about that. And truthfully, I think some of these ideas regarding Quietism stem from the Protestant view of sola fide, or you just need faith. You don't need any works, you don't need to do anything, just have faith, and that's all you need. So that, of course, is incorrect. We need to dispose our souls. We need to actively do that. We need to sacrifice. We need to eliminate undue or inordinate attachments to the world. And that is the way that we advance in grace and in our relationship with God. It's not just by sitting back and waiting for God to do everything. Another one, this is the first one, or this is a misunderstanding by those who are practicing the divine will, and I didn't have a good term for it, so I just labeled it the binary view. And the definition is, it's a misconception that there exists two stages. You're either in or out of the divine will. This is a view that you're either in the divine will or you're out of the divine will. And what the implications are is you're in the divine will, everyone's the same. You're in the divine will. And that's all there is. You just have to be in the divine will. Well, the misconception we just went through stated that's not the case. You need to dispose your soul and you need to advance. There's 4 degrees in the divine will, but within the 4 degrees there's many different unique statuses, so to speak, of a soul that's in the divine will. And here's a quote which Jesus explains to Luisa. My daughter, our love is so great that we fix different degrees of beauty and sanctity to adorn the soul in our divine will. We will make these souls different from one another, distinct in their beauty, sanctity, and love, but all beautiful, all unique. You could be high up in degree 3, or you could be the bottom of degree 3. And as Jesus mentions here, we have different graces. sanctity, and love. There's various degrees within that third degree, as an example. And number 2, dispensationalism. And I apologize for the large words, but this is one that I've seen thrown about. And unfortunately, it's another misunderstanding by people that are practicing the divine will. The term itself is a reference to a 200-year-old heresy concerning 7 dispensations of how God relates to his creatures. In other words, 7 segments in history, going back from creation onward. And the reason why that idea is a heresy is that, just as it says dispensation, the idea is if you're in one dispensation, you really just need to be concerned with that one dispensation. So everything that preceded it, whether it's the Old Testament, whether it's sacraments, as some interpretations have it, that would mean that you need to dispose of them or disregard them. So that's why it's a heresy. So you see that applied often to Protestant denominations, where they believe that they can dispense with sacraments and they don't need to have communion, confession, so and so forth. Unfortunately, some people inside of the divine will misinterpret some of the writings of Luisa to believe that they can also dispense with certain sacraments. And I'll bring up a quote from the Book of Heaven, Jesus to Luisa. "Now for one who lives in my will, as she, the soul, receives them, sacraments from the church, she will feel that as food that she possesses, but that she takes in order to give complete glory to those sacraments." So here Jesus is saying she takes these sacraments to give complete glory to those sacraments. So that does not sound like Jesus does not want us to take the sacraments or engage in sacramental life. Just the opposite. So I want to point out that I read recently regarding a new order that was set up, the Benedictines, Daughters of the Divine Will, and the Monks of the Divine Will. And I was just reading some of their requirements for oblates. And one of them was confession. Go to confession every month. It doesn't say that, hey, if you're in the 4th degree, don't go to confession. You don't need to. And we talk about confession a little bit more when we talk about the 4 degrees video. And I definitely recommend that. You're expected to participate in the life of the church. There's no dispensing of sacraments. There's no dispensing of going to church. You're still expected to say the rosary as an example, because that's very efficacious. And it's important for the life of the church and for everyone. Another thing, maybe go off on a little segue here, is that when we talked about a misunderstanding concerning the will of being in and out of the divine will, often there's a misreading of the Book of Heaven where Jesus is referring to those who live in my will. And he's actually referring to the 4th degree of the will. In the 4th degree, it's a very holy, life. Basically, it's a life where you're 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot on the earth. And sin, again, we talk about this in the 4 degrees of the divine will in that video. Sin does not exist. You cannot sin in the 4th degree because you're sharing with the will of God through participation with him. And often people read Jesus saying things like, those who are in my will. It doesn't, if he's talking to someone who's in the 4th degree, that may not apply to someone who's in the 2nd degree or the 3rd degree. And he's speaking to Luisa, who is in the 4th degree, and to those he's encouraging because he wants everyone to live in the 4th degree. And last but not least, it's actually the one I see the most, Luisa's status within the church. And again, this is predominantly misunderstanding of people that are outside of the divine will, looking in, and maybe reading some commentary that could be old from regarding her Book of Heaven or something about Luisa from the past. And the definitions, just to paraphrase the comments, Luisa is not approved by the church, or Luisa's writings are not approved by the church. Well, there's a current update. So let's get this current to where we are today. So let's start back in 1994. Luisa Piccarreta's cause at the diocesan level began. So they do not do that for heretics or people that have produced heretical writings. 1997, 2 theologians commissioned by the church review Luisa's writings, submit their reports stating that they found nothing contrary to the Catholic faith or morals. 2004, Luisa's confessor and ardent supporter of the divine will and Luisa's writings was canonized, Saint Annabelle de Francia. 2005, the diocesan process was concluded and they recommended her cause and passed it to Rome. And Rome opened their investigation the following year in 2006. So at that level, they brought in 2 priest censors in 2010, and they were appointed, in this case, by the Holy See. They came back with the exact same verdict as in 1997. They found no issues concerning anything contrary to the Catholic faith or morals, and found nothing wrong or adverse with Luisa's writings. And that being said, in 2011, I mentioned that the Benedictines, they started 2 orders. One, the Daughters of the Divine Will, and I believe the Monks of the Divine Will were followed right after that. And in their rule states they read the writings of Luisa, the Book of Heaven, and her other writings. And that's part of their rule of life. In 2012, the faculty of the Pontifical Gregorian University of Rome approves Father Iannucci's PhD thesis concerning and supporting Luisa's writings. And in 2015, the Vatican publishes a highly favorable biography of Luisa called The Son of My Will. So you see, folks, where this is going. Now, this being said, this is highly favorable. Now, The church has not canonized Luisa yet. That's still in process. So where we are is we're kind of like in the story in the New Testament of the empty tomb, where the apostles are told about the empty tomb or Jesus rising from the dead, and they hurry and run to the tomb, and St. John gets there first, but he does not go in. He waits outside the tomb for Peter to arrive. And that's where we are right now. We're waiting for Peter. And we're doing just like St. John did back then. We're waiting for Peter to come and enter the tomb first. And I think that's the proper way of looking at it. We're looking at it like we want the church to do this. We need the church to do this. And the church will do it. And that's where we are. And so we find ourselves waiting at the door for Peter, who, according to Jesus, will arrive, because to an eternal God it is like it's already happened. Thank you for joining us on this video. And there are other videos on Elijah Cloak's YouTube channels. There's one on the fourth degree, which we mentioned a few times about the 4 degrees. That one is focused on the fourth. And one relating the mystics of Carmel and Luisa Piccarreta. And here's some excellent sources for the divine will. I recently added Facebook groups. That's a good way, especially these days where you might be still in lockdown, of having some community in the divine will. Again, thank you for joining.